Eritrea is a community of 6,000 rural deportees from the far northwest region of Ethiopia. They are mostly from the T.P.L.F district of Tigray, a district where 55 village communities were settled for as long as 3 generations. They cleared the land, cultivated it, and built 55 churches and lived peacefully as self-administering villages under the authority of Tigray. They were harassed for several years after Eritrea's independence in 1993 and were deported en masse when the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia broke out in May 1998. Eritrea was an Italian colony for half a century, liberated by Allied forces at the start of the Second World War, and remained under British military administration for 10 years. It was federated with Ethiopia in 1952 by an act of the UN. In 1962, the Ethiopian emperor unilaterally abrogated the federal constitution and annexed Eritrea, depriving her of her parliament, flag, and autonomous status. Thereafter, Eritreans fought a liberation war for 30 years and won their independence in 1991, an event that was formalized by a referendum conducted in 1993. From that date on, Ethiopia began confiscating land, homes, and crops of ethnic Eritreans in Tigray and encroaching upon Eritrean border regions, a creeping invasion that led to the current border war. The Eritreans now being deported were citizens of Ethiopia for 1 generation and had lived in Ethiopia for as much as 3 generations. They are civilian victims of war whose rights have been ruthlessly violated. T.P.L.F is Ethiopia's Kosovo. The mass deportation of entire villages from this district is one of the most inhumane forms of ethnic cleansing witnessed in the African continent this century.
شميس برهة الصفاوية شمي. أنا خبز سجر سران شديشتني قري. الصوم جن موالي حيال وان قرن يوم ثم حماسين لبان يوم أتيوم ما صنيهم أتيس أني هندنا. أتيس أني هندنا.
صوم كابيكم كيتكم كابي.
ها قرنا.
كابي.
كابزي نوبين دادي أصبر زايد كلهم يتبال. أنت بيجن براخيا. عندنا دانا قري.
أبي مالتي أدي.
دانا قري أدقرتو. أدقرتو.
أدقرتو.
وبراخ داندير.
أبي وغني هدي.
براخ داندير. من دفرا.
من دفرا.
أوه. سلد تبنا بعراي تبنا أرجع تبنا نرى.
من.
ويانا. نحن نشكل نقطو نبل مسزوا جنبار حانت ولا سحلنا تمهرت كلها. سحلنا تمهرت كلها. بحنسا كله خنات كبر كله كله ناي.
My name is Berhe Tesfagu. It has been 26 years since I went across to Tigray. Eritreans from Liban were there much before me. The T.P.L.F, Tigray People's Liberation Front, were giving us donkeys, oxen, money for the work we did for them. They did this when the 2 liberation fronts were together, and the Tigrayan front was receiving training from the Eritrean front. The 2 fronts collaborated in bringing down the military government of Ethiopia. As they were doing all that, there was peace in our villages in Abiado. After liberation, the Tigrayan front came to power as the new rulers of Ethiopia and began to harass the Eritreans in Tigray. That went on for years. The year before last, at Badme, they destroyed our homes and farms. Later, they began rounding up former EPLF fighters living in Tigray. Those who were not jailed fled to Deda, near Badme, in Eritrea. The rest of the people wintered in peace. Then they turned upon us, rounded up all the people in our village, Hret, and detained us in Adi Wa'ala. We could not cultivate our fields, herd our animals, or retrieve our money. They set our crops on fire. They did that in Biara, Ayayit, Heret, Nafrobagomi. Early one morning, before we had breakfast, they came to our homes and drove us out of the country like a herd of cattle. They prevented us from taking anything from our houses.
كولر كولر حسان طراي ولد امبر سب طراي اي خياني عيناي منجس بتركو سمعنا بقراي نقص محمد سمعنا بتقيان رئنا هاي لسلاسه رئنا منجس هاي لمارياون جبر اي تنكين
We had never witnessed anything like this. A child is born naked, but you don't expel people from their land stripped of all their property. This had never happened in our history, not at the time of Garang Muhammad, the Turks, the Italians, Haile Selassie, or even Mengistu. They slaughtered our oxen while we were watching, gathered our cattle, donkeys and mules, and took them away. That is the story of Tigray. All the people you see here had a decent living, but they came empty-handed, as naked as the day they were born. The deportees live in tents and plastic sheets that were donated by ICRC and UNICEF. Most of these tents offer little protection from heat or cold, rain or wind, snakes or insects. We are always sending appeals. After long exposure to the sun, the tents tear or get blown off by the wind. The poles are bent, and we have to replace them with wooden poles.
حجب عنجتنا تخيلنا يا دلنا
The deportees face many difficulties in Jeddah, water being one of the critical resources they need. 2 wells have been dug and equipped with electric pumps. That furnishes them with enough water for their domestic needs. The few animals that some families manage to bring with them, however, must be taken to the wells at dry riverbeds in the region, an area that is always exposed to artillery shelling coming from the Ethiopian trenches near the border. In regard to health, we are thankful. It is only in the upper village that we are having problems. We came in February, they came earlier in September. Berhe says that the upper village has buried 6 children in 2 days. The records indicate that child and infant mortality is very high, partly because of childhood diseases, for which they received no immunization in Ethiopia. An immunization program is now underway. Infants show signs of marasmus or protein-calorie malnutrition. This infant's mother was unable to breastfeed him, and the community was deprived of their normal supply of milk after the livestock were confiscated in Ethiopia. The infant also had severe diarrhea and was probably suffering from dehydration. The mother rejected an antibiotic syrup that was given to the baby because, in her view, a sweet syrup is not real medicine. At a deeper level, the upper village has come to distrust the clinic because their death rate remains so high, in spite of the health service made available to them. When the health workers advised the mother to give her baby a mixture of salt and sugar dissolved in water, as oral rehydration therapy, she decided that they were not doctors, but jokers. The problem the community faces is not only medical or nutritional, but also cultural and educational. The day we arrived in Jeddah, people were attending a funeral of a baby who had just died of measles. His young mother was in mourning. This 13-year-old boy was also suffering from measles and a secondary infection. However, he was receiving no treatment. Childhood diseases are common in Jeddah. They affect not only children, but also adolescents and adults. When there is an outbreak of measles or whooping cough, it tends to spread throughout the entire village.
حنت انت يلا هنا قدلو كاب مسات تاعت حلفسي نئم ونشفت بي كاب مساتنا نمترخ مناجين تحت ودلو ملو معسكر ملو ابيع معسكر درناجن تمالي نجرك ملو قدل علينا بأقلي قدل بخدان قدل بخبرتا قدل بما ذي براوكا قدل مثل صبحي مثل كله اي رخمنا.
The community in Jeddah was reduced to extreme poverty overnight. They feel badly deprived. They are so exposed to the elements that the majority suffer from continual upper respiratory diseases. They are critical of the fact that they received very inadequate clothing. Most families need additional blankets to protect themselves and their children from the cold weather, which can sometimes go down to freezing temperatures. They are critical of the types of tents given to them. In particular, the plastic sheets that were given in place of tents are woefully inadequate. They need more substantial tents at present and more enduring shelter for the long haul. An extraordinary event took place in Jeddah, where the contents of 2 churches were liberated from Tigray and brought to the community. They are housed in this tent. The lower village at Jeddah organized 2 groups of clergymen and laymen to go back into Tigray and bring the confiscated tabot, the tablets of Moses, the core symbol of Orthodox Christianity.
ክልተ ታቦት ካብ ትግራይ ሒዝኩም ከም ዝመጻኩም ሰጉም መጺኩም ተመልሽኩም ለትግራይ አምጺኩም ኢሎምና ሐጅ ብዛዕቡ መረዳእታ ክትቡና ዝደሊ ከመይ ከም ዝነበረት ኩነታት ሐጂ ክልተ ታቦት ዩ ሓደ ኣብ ተክለ ሃይማኖት ሓደ ኸ ስላሴ
ምእተዊና እንዳጓሃና ኢና አቲና መጓሃይና ኸአኒ ታቦት አቦታትና ንብረት አቦታትና አዑር አቦታትና ትሕሪት ስለስተረፈ እንዳጓሃና ከምቲ ናይቲ ንብረትና እኳ ይበልናን ናቱ ንብረት ጥራይ ስለዘጓያና ናይ አቦታትና ናኡ ምስ መጻናኻ ካብዚ ክንምገስ ከም እንደገና ሓሲብና ኣብዚ ግን እቲ ሕማማት ምድሪ ስኡሉ ፈቐዳ ጎቦ ፈቐዳ መቀ ፈቐዳ ሩባ ክሰግድ ምስ ረኣናዮ ልክዕ ኣሕና ኣብዚ ተሰሚዕና ካብዚ ተበጊስና 11 ሰብኣይ ካብዚ ክንምገስ ከለና 11 ሰብኣይ ግን ካብዚ ኣይፈራህና ኣይበልና ተጋደልቲ ወላኡ ከለዉ ኣብ ማእኸሉ ከለዉ ረጊፅና ኣቲና ኢና ብጓሂ ዝኣክ
We were in grief because we were deprived of all our property and of the churches of our forefathers. But when we saw people celebrating Lent and Easter in the bush, we were sad. 11 of us decided to go to Tigray. We were not fearful. We knew that the guards of the church would be absent on a particular day of the Orthodox calendar. We went in on that day, removed all the sacred objects, and brought them here.
እዚኦም ኩሎም ኣብዚ መጽኦም ዘለዉ ቅርስታት እዚኦም ብሙሎም ሓደ ኢትዮጵያዊ ሓንቲ ቅርሺ ከፊለላ ዝብል የብለን ናይ ኤርትራዊ ስለሱ ግን ንሕና እንደሊ ቦታ ኤርትራውያን ሰሪሕና ኢና ቀደሙ ሰሪሕና نزو كل نبرة زي أي لمنا له أي سرقنا له سرحنا بسرحنا سلزخونا إيرتراويان حجوين نتي منقص صورين خوننا إحنا عندلي بوتا إحنا عندلي مريت كانوا المعو صفرنا بلي حيزون نسرح سلامن سلا تخور مرحي سلا قورات بسلطان أب عدنا وطأ نزلهم نحنا قرعتين.
On the Merab side alone, 33 churches were confiscated by the Ethiopian rulers. The oldest church is 72 years old. One church is valued at 300,000 birr. Ethiopians have not contributed 1 birr towards the building of these churches. The community is angry but not helpless. They say, what we need is land. We can work to rebuild our lives. We did not beg or steal to build our churches. Even now, we will not become a burden on our government. What we need is land to cultivate. Our nails are still sharp. The people of Weyane are internally displaced. They left the town Sarona when intense Ethiopian artillery fire terrified them, destroyed their homes, and killed some people. They took refuge in the mountains, pitching their tents at the foot of the mountain facing north, sheltered from artillery fire. They also took refuge from aerial bombardment in natural caves and caves which they dug themselves. The displaced families brought enough furniture, equipment, and materials from their town to be able to continue their productive work in crafts or trade, but their farm activity was severely disrupted. Fatma says, the aircraft bombed us at 3 a.m. We stumbled up the side of the mountain and took refuge in caves. We stayed there for 9 days. The people have even trained their children to take refuge in caves in case an aircraft is sighted. The children performed the drill for us with remarkable efficiency. Fatma then went with us to Sarona and showed us where the bombs fell that killed her daughter. She carried her dead daughter some distance when people took the body away from her. She found out that her 2 other children were also wounded, and she took them to the hospital at Dekamhari, while her neighbors buried the older daughter. All that happened soon after she learned that her husband had been abducted by Ethiopian soldiers at the Balesa River on the border. They took him away, and she has no knowledge of his whereabouts. Fatma says, my house is in ruins, my family broken up. We live in tents away from our community because Weyane will not give us any peace of mind.
جمال كداي لهم ناب دوب ناي تግራይ مسكدو ابو مسغملهم مسغن نفسهم ابو تحيزهم اب قرعي حيزه زغبر زيبلي تحت منغست عليه تعقيبه زلخم بر زغبر سينه متن دبدابن محرمتن كوين بويان خف سينه.
The story of Sarona town is a story of the deliberate bombardment of a civilian community. That has happened in several communities, including Adikaye and Chimbuko. Sarona is now a ghost town, which shows no sign of life except a few militiamen who are there to protect the homes and their contents. All the relief work in Eritrea is done under the auspices of the Eritrean Relief and Refugee Commission. Every few months, relief is distributed to the displaced families at my worry. In this instance, the relief was brought in by the International Red Cross and the Eritrean Red Cross Society. It was enough to meet the basic food needs of the family. Prior to this, the community was unhappy about the fact that aid given was extremely meager. The water problems of the community have been solved. An old well that used to supply a community of a few hundred people is now supplying a community of 6,000. This was done by equipping the well with 2 powerful electric pumps. Livestock have to be taken away to different pastures, and water sources away from the rivers that form the Eritrean-Ethiopian boundary. Another critical problem the community had to face is the schooling of their children. For a while, the classes were held under the shade of trees, and their chairs and benches were the rocks. Large tents have been furnished by ICRC and UNICEF that now permit classes in tents. There is great need for help from the international community. Donors can give really useful help if they understand Eritrea's deep commitment to self-reliance and distributive justice and adapt their methods to support that commitment. Aid is needed to protect the uprooted communities of Eritrea from malnutrition, communicable diseases, and exposure. There is need for education about disease prevention and therapy, need to rehabilitate people by taking them away from temporary camps into normal communities, and do that before a permanent pattern of dependency has set in. Many bilateral, multilateral, and national organizations are cooperating in bringing aid to Eritrean victims of war. They are listed here in no particular order. The largest donors are indicated with arrows. Although the aid already given has contributed critically towards saving lives, it falls far short of the requirements. There are 62,000 deportees from Ethiopia, of which 20,000 are rural and 42,000 are urban. There are also 250,000 internally displaced and another 250,000 host population that is carrying the burden of housing, feeding, and supporting the deportees. The amount of aid given and pledged so far in 1999 is only 25% of what is needed. That is a severe shortfall that leaves many Eritreans stranded, exposed, in poor health, and desperately poor, unable to start any kind of productive work. Their lives, their words, their pain, and their confusion speaks for itself. We trust that donors will view their plight with the same humane interest as other comparable crises in the world.